So my name is Alys Beverton, Dr. Alys Beverton. I'm a senior lecturer at Oxford Brookes University in the UK. And I'm very pleased to be giving this presentation. I want to say thank you, of course, to Mike for organising this. And thank you to everyone who is watching right now. It's a real honour and pleasure to be doing this event. So thank you. Thank you for your time. So I'm going to talk for around 40 minutes. And I very much look forward to hearing what questions that you have coming out of this presentation. Hopefully my audio will keep working and I won't drop out of connection or anything. So let's begin. On the 22nd of April, 1865, Mexico's minister to the United States, a man called Matias Romero, called upon Andrew Johnson at the White House. In addition to wanting to formally introduce himself to the newly inaugurated president, Romero had come to discuss something that was troubling him. The Mexican government had recently informed Romero that since General Lee's surrender earlier that month, hundreds of Confederate soldiers, including a good many officers, had crossed the border into Mexico. These were not transient veterans wandering directionless across the continent. Rather, Minister Romero believed that these erstwhile rebels were flowing directly into the arms of the Mexican Empire. So, some of you may have noticed that I just mentioned two governments existing in Mexico there. One empire, one republic. Allow me to explain. In 1862, the French Emperor Louis Napoleon had invaded Mexico. By the following year, he had installed a constitutional monarchy in that country and named it the Mexican Empire. He had also placed at the head of this Mexican Empire the Austrian Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian, the gentleman here who you can see standing. Meanwhile, Mexico's Republican government, headed by this gentleman here, President Benito Juarez, had been kicked out of Mexico City and was now what they called a government in exile, operating and orchestrating a military resistance to the empire while on the run. Resistance to the empire sounds a little bit like I'm talking about Star Wars here. So just to explain, we have on the one side the Mexican Empire, headed by Archduke Maximilian, also known as the Imperialists. Their forces are a combination of French troops. They have some support from conservative Mexicans and also some support from the church hierarchy in Mexico. On the other side, we have the Mexican Republic, headed by Benito Juarez, also known as the Liberals, the Republicans, or the Juarists. Romero warned President Johnson that the ex-rebel migrants going into Mexico wished to lend their support to the Maximilian regime. In return, they apparently hoped that Maximilian would help them to sustain a guerrilla war against the United States along the US southern border. So Johnson was sympathetic to what Romero had to say, but he was also non-committal. Johnson's big concern at this time, remember we're talking April 1865, his big concern at this time was he does not want to provoke a war with France or a conflict of any kind with France at this stage. For the very understandable reason that the United States is in a very delicate position right now, just emerging from its civil war. It doesn't feel wise to Johnson to go and provoke, take action against the Mexican Empire, which is being propped up again by French troops. You don't really want to pick a war with France at this time. So Johnson declined to commit to any official action to prevent the Confederate migration. or indeed to help the Juarists more generally. However, he indicates to Romero that he will not obstruct any unofficial efforts to lend aid to the Mexican Republicans that emanate from the United States. This was encouragement enough for Romero. And luckily for him, he was not the only one in Washington, D.C. at that time who was concerned about the Confederate migration. Another was the commanding general of the US Army, Ulysses S. Grant. Grant also believed that the Confederate migration posed a security threat to the United States. As luck would have it, he was also in Washington at the same time as Romero. He was there to participate in Union Army celebrations. The two men met and they hit it off. They were like-minded on this issue, but actually they personality-wise they meshed quite well. And this was actually the beginning of a friendship that would last for a couple of decades until Grant's death in the 1880s. So in May 1865, or by May 1865, Romero and Grant had devised a plan. They would march a body of troops. They bandy about a few numbers, but they settle on between 50 and 60,000, they say. March a body of troops down to the southern US border, muster them out, and then have them cross the border as private citizens and be absorbed into the Juarist army. Now, Johnson had said to Romero to keep any plan that he makes covert. It has to be unofficial. But there was reason to believe that the American people would support this plan if it ever did become public. And that's because at this time, there was a huge amount of public goodwill in the United States towards the Mexican Republic. Okay, so allow me, if you will, I'm just going to step back for a moment and talk about my book as a whole. So the idea for it first came to me when I became aware of the scale of support in the United States for Mexican Republicans fighting the French. Sympathy in the United States first began when the Napoleon first invaded in 1862, and it just built and built over the course of the next few years during, of course, the Civil War in the United States. All major newspapers in the US followed events in Mexico closely. They followed this war with France. Almost all of them came to express favorable views of the Mexican Republicans, and were highly critical of France and of the French and their conservative Mexican allies. Not only newspapers, but politicians as well from both major parties, Republican and Democrat, expressed their support for the Mexican Republic, and in fact made a lot of speeches on the subject, issued resolutions to Congress on the subject as well. And patriotic organizations as well, societies such as the Union Leagues, which were ostensibly formed to promote the Union war effort, actually spent quite a good amount of time promoting the Mexican war effort as well. They hold public rallies, they throw extravagant dinners and invite the Mexican diplomatic corps to them, including Romero. And this sympathy just continues, this outpouring of support for Mexico just continues after the Civil War. And what's interesting and what I've alluded to is that after this, once the Civil War is over, a new voice in this pro-Mexican outpouring are Union Army veterans and officers as well. So Grant, not just Grant, but Nathaniel Banks, Schofield, Sheridan, they all come out and not only say how much they support the Mexican Republican cause, but call on the Johnson administration to do something to aid the Juarists. And meanwhile, Union Army veterans flocked to the Juarist army in their hundreds, if not thousands, after 1865. Now, I won't spend too much time today talking about Mexican policy per se. So the decision making of the Lincoln administration or the Johnson administration about whether to intervene or not in the conflict in Mexico. And I'm very happy to take questions on it. It does feature in my book. However, today, what I want to focus on instead is the nature of popular support for Mexico, especially as it manifested in the American press. Newspapers, and to a lesser extent, pamphlets and speeches really form the backbone of the source base for my book. It's very much a study of public discourse, of language, of the conversations people were having in public about these matters. On the pages of Union newspapers, the Union and Mexican causes became linked, and I'll explain how in just a moment. This linking, this coupling, gave rise to a language of sister republicanism, continental fraternity, pan-American unity, which is, and you can see some examples of it here. I've given you some snippets from the press. Our sister republic. We shall be the defenders of the Monroe Doctrine. This kind of language. And I just thought, when I first came across this, I just thought it was kind of extraordinary. Just the depth and breadth of US support for Mexico in the 1860s in this particular moment, given what we know about the US-Mexican relationship in the 19th century more broadly. It's an extremely fraught relationship. It's marked by conflict, continuous conflicts over territory, unpaid debts, smuggling, lawlessness on the border. I mean, the two countries are constantly wrangling each other, especially kind of for the first 70 years of the 19th century, I'd say. And indeed, what I knew before I studied this was that, by the 1850s, there was a well-entrenched perception in the United States of Mexico as a failed republic, as an anarchic place, an unstable place, a place where revolutions and rebellions and civil wars are just constantly boiling and roiling over and over. And so common was this perception of Mexico that, or rather so familiar was it, that Mexico in the minds of mid-century Americans was really a byword for failed republicanism more broadly. And in particular, Mexico had come to them to represent really all the failings of Spanish American republicanism in general. So prevalent was this stereotype, in fact, that US Americans in the first half of the 19th century often used Mexico as a counterpoint to their own national identity. So Mexico's failings, and by extension, the failings of all Spanish American republics, were proof that somehow the United States, with its wealth, its stability, its prosperity, they were proof that the United States was somehow uniquely blessed, that it was perhaps the exceptional republic. So given this, that led me to ask, how did Americans in the 1860s switch so rapidly and so radically in their views of Mexico? And the thing I was really interested in was, so what did that do? What did that process do for their logic, the logic of US exceptionalism? How did they square those two things? So in searching for answers, I made a few discoveries, and today I want to talk about two. I want to make 2 points to you. Here they are. First, my first point is that the popular sentiments of continental fraternity, sister republicanism, this unity with Mexico, support for Mexico, that emerged in the 1860s in the United States, was in fact underpinned by deep US insecurities about their own republic. which I argue amounted to a crisis of exceptionalism. Second, these popular insecurities, I argue, had political power. They were manipulated by political leaders to move voters in the United States towards certain policies, and in particular towards certain methods for reunion after Southern secession. Today, I'm going to give you an example by discussing how it was used by the advocates of radical reconstruction, though the book examines others too. And again, I'd be happy to discuss them further in the Q&A. So my book goes from the secession crisis up to the early 1880s. Today, I'm going to illustrate my 2 points by focusing on a very small time period, 1865 to 1867. So, to the first point. Soon after the start of the French invasion of Mexico in 1862, the Union press began to draw parallels between that conflict and the Confederate rebellion then ongoing. Slaveholders, French imperialists, Mexican monarchists, the Catholic priesthood, they said, were all advocates of hierarchy, tradition, hereditary privilege. They were the enemies of liberty and democracy. And many newspapers in the US went so far as to claim that these forces were not just similar, they were in league with one another. That it was no coincidence that Louis Napoleon had chosen 1862, the year after the Civil War had begun, to launch his invasion of Mexico. That there was collusion going on, that these two forces were coordinating their assaults on the North American republics. As they came to see their enemies as aligned, Union newspapers began to rethink their previous stereotypes about Mexico. They began to see the country in a new light. One trend that I've seen is that they are much more open to distinguishing between different groups in Mexican society. So yes, we have the priesthood and we have conservative Mexicans, those in Mexico who prefer a monarchy. However, we also have those who are liberals, who are Republicans. In making this distinction, they start to revisit their old theories about why Mexico had struggled so much to stabilize its political institutions since becoming a republic. So in the 1850s in the United States, the common theory was that there was some character flaw in Mexico, that there was it was to do with the racial makeup of the country was probably the most common theory. That the population just wasn't suited to self-governance. In the 1860s, however, Union newspapers begin to rethink this, and they start to make the argument that no, it's not all Mexicans, it's the Mexican conservatives who are the real problem. These are the anti-Republican kind of internal cancer in the Mexican Republic. These are the ones causing all the trouble. Meanwhile, they come to view the Mexican liberals, those currently fighting off the French, fighting the Mexican Empire, as worthy. They're demonstrating their martial spirit. They're demonstrating their patriotic devotion. They are truly Republicans and worthy allies of us. So on the one hand, the Mexican Republic is elevated in the eyes of the Union press. What's interesting, though, is that there was a corresponding simultaneous process going on by which these same newspapers begin to think more negatively about their own republic. 19th century Americans had been taught that the United States existed outside of the laws that governed other nations, that their nation was immune to the civil wars and domestic rebellions that were typical of republics both ancient and modern. Southern secession in 1860-61 shattered this illusion. It was no longer tenable to claim that Providence had spared the United States alone from internal convulsions, the kind of convulsions that were common in Spanish America. And so the Union press began making comparisons, and these were not favorable comparisons, with the Spanish American republics, but particularly Mexico. I've given you some examples here from the press. What emerged in the 1860s was this language of Mexicanization. This fear, this theory that the United States is becoming Mexicanized, it is becoming like Mexico. Underneath this notion of Mexicanization is the idea that maybe the United States is not exceptional after all. And these concerns first emerged in 1860, 1861, were not put to rest by the Civil War's ending. Let's return to 1865. As we know, this was the year that the Civil War ended, but the French intervention in Mexico raged on. Intoxicated by the triumphalism following Appomattox, Union Army officers, public officials, and newspapermen called on their government to carry on the fight against autocracy now in Mexico. So there's a lot of confidence, public confidence following Appomattox, and a lot of enthusiasm for the United States to just send its army south of the border. What's really interesting to me, actually, is how short-lived that enthusiasm is. Calls for an intervention in Mexico fade pretty rapidly as 1865 progresses. I think part of the reason is that the post-war triumphalism of the early weeks after Appomattox is quite quickly replaced by a creeping uncertainty that enters the national mood as the question of Reconstruction begins to loom ever larger. In the summer of 1865, Johnson was pushing ahead his plan to readmit the rebel states. His terms for re-entry were minimal, and aimed at facilitating a speedy reunion between the states. Meanwhile, news from the South reported that legislatures were enacting black codes to limit the freedom and rights of newly freed Black Americans, effectively replicating aspects of the slave system. What was interesting is that similar news was actually coming from Mexico at this time. Now, let me explain that. We already know that hundreds of ex-Confederates were flocking to that country. In September 1865, Emperor Maximilian issues a decree. That decree says that all Black immigrants who come from the United States into Mexico must be contracted to a patron for a period of at least 5 years. Now, the Mexican Republic had outlawed slavery in 1837, but Maximilian, through this decree, was signaling to ex-Confederates that they could enter his country with what remained, or what they had left, of their human property, if they could get it there. Certain US newspapers were, to say the least, incensed by this news. Let me give some quotes. The Black-owned South Carolina Leader reported in November 1865, quote, "Not satisfied with offending the United States by overthrowing the republicanism of Mexico, Maximilian has added to his impertinence slavery under the name of serfdom or peonage in an effort to persuade persons whom he calls emigrants to settle in the country." Another quote, this time from the Connecticut newspaper, the Hartford Daily Courant. Quote, "The difference between this patronage and undisguised slavery is too small to be appreciated." End quote. Meanwhile, the New York Tribune pointed out that Maximilian's decree did, quote, "not essentially differ from the slave laws and new apprenticeship forms recently passed by the reformed Southern state legislatures." End quote. The newspaper surmised from this that ex-Confederates in Mexico and those remaining in the United States were conspiring in a joint effort to, quote, "conserve all the despotism of slavery while rendering its legal aspect more plausible," end quote. So let's break that down for a minute. Then they're noticing parallels here, right? There's efforts to, they believe there's efforts to resuscitate slavery both in the US South and in Mexico. And the big concern of these newspapers is that these efforts, again, it's not a coincidence, right? They are done in coordination, they are inspiring each other, they are emboldening each other. There's a mutual reinforcing and fueling going on. That's the theory that they're working on. The newspapers are also concerned that if ex-Confederates in Mexico, it looks like they're trying to essentially reform a slaveocracy in Mexico. And their fear is that if this works, if that slaveocracy amasses wealth and power, it could come to dominate the government in Mexico. And from that, could eventually orchestrate a conflict between the Mexican Empire and the United States. Now, it's a chilling thought, given in particular how fragile the United States felt at this time. And there were worrying reports that were kind of hotly re-reported by the press coming from army officials in the South, describing the doubtful nature of white Southern loyalty to the United States and what they would do in the event of such a war between the Mexican Empire. So again, let me give you some quotes. During the congressional hearings on Reconstruction in March 1866, for example, Major General George Henry Thomas warned the ex-rebel leaders in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi anticipated that, quote, in case the government should become involved in foreign war, they would watch their opportunities to strike for independence of the states lately in rebellion. General Benjamin Grierson predicted that, quote, in such an event, the enemies of the government throughout the South would declare their support for the Mexican Empire, rise up in insurrection against the United States, and attempt again its destruction, end quote. April 1865 marked the formal end of the war between the North and South. Viewed from a continental perspective, however, it was clear that the wider battle between autocracy and republicanism in North America raged on, and that the United States was still vulnerable to the machinations of the slavocratic monarchical conspiracy, both from within and just beyond its borders. The situation in Mexico, in short, made it painfully apparent that the post-war United States remained weak, divided, and very far from possessing its previously commanding position on the continent. So what I hope I've given you so far is some sense of what I mean by this crisis of exceptionalism, and how yes, it began during the Civil War, but it lasted beyond it. Now I want to make my second point, which is that this mood of uncertainty, instability, insecurity, this doubting of the national identity, had political uses. Between September 1866 and April 1867, there were midterm elections in the United States. The results saw Republicans taking control of both houses of Congress with majorities large enough to overrule a presidential veto. The new Congress immediately began overturning Johnson's lenient Reconstruction and enacting a root and branch transformation of the South's political and social order. Few examples. The first Reconstruction Act of March 1867 divided the former rebel states into 5 districts and placed each one under martial law. Later that month, the second Reconstruction Act put US troops in charge of registering voters and overseeing elections in the Southern Territories. Finally, Congress announced that in order to be readmitted into the Union, the former rebel states must redraft their state constitutions to include ratification of the 14th Amendment. So Republican-aligned newspapers were keen for ways to sell this raft of radical legislation to the public, a public which they well knew were not necessarily as radical as they or the congressman. The situation in Mexico offered them one means of doing this. First, so how could the situation in Mexico help them sell the project of radical reconstruction? Allow me to attempt to explain this, make this argument. So first, the continued existence of the Maximilian Empire and the presence of Confederates in Mexico all was still a reminder of that the slave power was still alive, it still had international allies, and there was still work left to be done to defeat them, that the Confederate surrender was not the end, right? Second, the situation in Mexico allowed newspapers to paint a picture for readers in the United States of what would happen not just to the United States, but to the continent if radical reconstruction was successfully implemented. So let me show you how they made this argument. The months immediately following Appomattox saw the Mexican Liberal Army strengthen its hold over the states of Sinaloa and Chihuahua and occupy almost every significant town on the Rio Grande. So straight after Appomattox, there was a surge in the Juarist war effort. Interestingly, if you read the reaction of US newspapers, they're very quick to credit not the Juarists necessarily for this, but the United States. Let me show you some examples. So the New York Herald's Mexico City correspondent, for example, said this, quote, "The news of the Union Army's triumph afforded vast encouragement to the adherents of President Juarez. New spirits have been infused into the Republican armies south of the border, and nearly the whole of northern Mexico is now under the authority of Juarez." And it's not just the New York Herald. Loads of newspapers do this. They say Union victory and this surge in the Juarist war effort, they cannot be unconnected. There must be a relationship between the two. But there's another side to this. So before long, this Juarist military surge falters. Maximilian's troops launch a very successful counter-assault, which by the end of 1865 sees them in control of several key northern cities in Mexico, including Chihuahua and Matamoros. Once again, US newspapers explained this by pointing to their own nation. So they take the good with the bad. The Chicago Tribune, for example, insisted that the Juarists' losses, quote, "were due to the distracted condition into which our domestic politics are again thrown by President Johnson's proceedings." So the logic is that Maximilian and his followers had been shaken by Confederate surrender, appalled to see their valuable ally fall. However, the defiance the ex-rebels in the South had shown since then, and the success they had had in clawing back much of their power under presidential reconstruction, had apparently inspired Maximilian and his supporters with fresh hope that the conservative cause on the continent was not lost. The Hartford Daily Courant agreed with this theory, and it added that a thoroughgoing reconstruction program was therefore necessary because it would expunge rebellious elements from the South, finally stabilize the United States' political institutions, and therefore rejuvenate the country's moral force, and they use this phrase, moral force, in the minds of Mexican liberals, emboldening them to then press ahead with their own war effort. So again, worth pausing here. They're not advocating a US intervention in Mexico to help the Juarists. They're actually saying that's not necessary. All that's necessary is for the United States to focus on its own domestic politics, to expunge the last of the die-hard rebels from political power. And in this way, the United States' symbolic moral force as the exemplary republic would be renewed. And the force of it would radiate outwards from the United States over the border into Mexico. They would inspire the Juarists to then push again in their war effort. They're putting a lot in this idea of the United States having symbolic power. They think that this is a real thing to them, symbolic power. Harper's new monthly magazine agreed with all of this and then extended it further and said that there will be benefits to this beyond just resolving the war in Mexico. Congressional Reconstruction, the newspaper said, would restore to the United States its, quote, vital power as the world's standard bearer of self-governance, enabling Americans to act on foreign nations rather by our example of freedom and prosperity than by meddlesome intervention, end quote. Awed by the United States' success in recovering from its civil war, neighboring countries would seek to imitate its political institutions and open up their economies to US technologies, products, and capital. Whew. So, in short, radical reconstruction would enable the United States to, quote, dominate the continent by the force of our own prosperity and intelligence, liberty and order. So, they're basically saying that congressional reconstruction would not only help the Juarists win back their republic, it would also convert all of Spanish America into, admiring satellites of the United States and bring them into its orbit, because they would all want to kind of participate and be part of and benefit from the power and prestige of this renewed post-emancipation exceptional US republic. Using a continental framework enabled the early advocates of congressional reconstruction to link their plans for the South to the fate of North America more broadly. Radical reconstruction would return the United States to its original role as the most successful of the New World republics, ushering a period of US hegemony marked by liberalism, democracy, and liberty for all on the continent. Should they fail to push on with this agenda, however, then the forces of aristocracy and hierarchy, still present in North America despite the fall of the Confederacy, would wage a counter-assault, swallowing up the continent in darkness. Okay, I'm just heading into the final bit now, and I just want to conclude with a few final thoughts. I think that we are sometimes guilty of giving the US Civil War a special place in our minds. Other countries' civil wars are destructive. They are ruinous. The United States, however, was regenerative, a watershed that the nation had to pass through to reach the next stage of its evolution, to move from a politics of slavery to a politics of freedom, to move on into modernity, to rid itself of the last shackles of colonialism. It's a comforting narrative. It's a satisfying narrative. But would contemporaries who lived through the conflict have recognized it? In my book, I argue that Americans, in fact, worried a great deal about their civil war and the effect that it would have long term on their nation. This concern, I argue, can be traced through perceptions of Mexico during the Civil War era. Before 1860, Mexico had been the foil to the United States, a counterpoint. Its failings proved the unique success of the United States. But the US Civil War saw the wall break down. Comparisons with Mexico now revealed similarities, not differences, and gave rise to a language of Mexicanization. Underpinning this language was the fear that the United States might be doomed to join Mexico on the list of failed New World republics, that their civil war was not exceptional, and nor was their republic. Now, my book charts this insecurity from its first appearance during the secession crisis, and it goes all the way up to the early 1880s, when analogies with Mexico and talk of Mexicanization finally faded from widespread use in the United States. Digging into this language, I think, reveals a really interesting duality at its heart. On the one hand, the idea that the United States and Mexico, in fact, shared common experiences, had similar trials and tribulations, was humbling for US Americans, and it inspired sympathy and affection among them for their southern neighbors. Hence, the rather remarkable burst of Pan American unity which infused the United States for much of the 1860s. At the same time, though, the language of Mexicanization, which emerged at the same time, revealed how uncomfortable US Americans were with the parallels that they could now see stretching across the Rio Grande. Mexicanization was to them a blight, a sickness, something to be cured. In this way, the continental framing had political power. Those wishing to sell a particular policy prescription could frame it as a way of saving the United States from Mexicanization. This framing appealed to Americans' pride and ambition on the one hand, and to their insecurities and fears on the other. Political leaders sold a range of policies for reunion to Americans on this basis, promising that their particular road out of the Civil War guaranteed the stabilization of US institutions and therefore the return to hemispheric glory befitting the exceptional republic. And each warned that failure to follow their policy would lead not just to national, but continental, perhaps even hemispheric disaster. The crisis of exceptionalism in this way, I think, generated its own political power in the Civil War era. And it's a mindset that we ought to recognize and appreciate if we wish to fully understand how Americans navigated a path from disunion to reunion. Thank you very much.